Thank you very much, Meryl. This evening, I have the privilege of introducing our special guest, Dr. Chad Hanson. He's a forest and fire ecologist and the director of the John Muir Project, and author of a book, which I will show, Smokescreen. I've read about 2/3 of it. It's an excellent summary of the latest research, both Dr. Chad's and other associates, international scientific research that carefully assess the nature of forest fires and their impacts on wildlife. And I highly recommend this book, Debunking Wildfire Myths to Save Our Forests and Our Climate. And take it away, Dr. Chad Hanson, and thank you so much for participating in our event series.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for attending and for the invitation to come and talk to you tonight. All right, so I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully everyone can see that okay. Coming through all right? Just give me a little thumbs up if that looks okay. All right, good deal. All right, yeah, so I'm going to talk about wildfires and climate change, and in our forests in particular, and some of the key misconceptions and myths that are getting in the way of us making real climate progress towards natural climate solutions, as well as getting in the way of important things like protecting communities from wildfires. And this is, of course, I talk about this a lot more in great detail in my book, Smokescreen, Debunking Wildfire Myths to Save Our Forests and Our Climate. And I'm going to focus on a few key aspects of the themes that I discuss in my book, Smokescreen, tonight. First, I'm going to start with, in the big picture, something that I think a lot of people understand tangentially, but maybe not to the extent that we need to. And that's this. In order to overcome the climate crisis, we have to do not one, but two things. We have to swiftly move beyond fossil fuel consumption as quickly as possible. But that's not enough. That will not get us where we need to get to. The simple problem is that once we put the excess CO2 in the atmosphere from fossil fuel consumption and logging activities, and a lot of people don't realize logging is a big contributor. Once we do that, the CO2 stays in our atmosphere for a very, very long time. The CO2 residence time is extremely long, many, many decades, even centuries. And so we're going to have to do more than that. We're going to have to draw it down from the atmosphere, those dangerous excess levels. And the most effective and most environmentally beneficial way to do that, far and away, is protecting natural ecosystems so that they can absorb more CO2 from the atmosphere. And especially that's true of forests, which absorb far more CO2 than most ecosystems. They're really remarkable in their ability to sequester carbon. In fact, natural climate solutions, in particular forest protection, can be as much as half of our needed climate change mitigation to get ourselves out of this mess. And so this is essential. It's not a discretionary thing. It's not optional. It's absolutely essential, just as much as moving away from fossil fuels. But there's a number of misconceptions about our forests that are getting in the way of us protecting forests so they can store more carbon and sequester more carbon. And a number of those myths and misconceptions have to do with wildfires. And so that's what I'm going to focus on tonight. The first one is the myth that fuel reduction activities out in forest wildlands is a community protection strategy, that will somehow save towns from wildfires. And we hear this a lot, this idea that, well, we'll go out there in the wildlands and we'll, with masticators and chainsaws and bulldozers, and we'll remove a lot of vegetation, and we'll call that fuel reduction or fuel breaks. And somehow that's going to stop the fires. So I want to deconstruct that a little bit. And of course, I go into a lot more detail on this in my book, Smokescreen, and there's a lot of anecdotes and personal accounts. I wrote this for non-scientists, although I have hundreds of scientific studies cited in the endnotes of my book. But the first key thing is, in terms of protecting homes, what the science is telling us is that the only effective way to do that is to focus on the homes themselves in terms of what we call home hardening, and then also what we call defensible space pruning within 100 feet around each home. And so this is not a wildlands vegetation management issue. This is a community protection issue. And in terms of home hardening, we're talking about simple things like rain gutter guards to prevent embers driven by the winds from landing on the roof and rolling down into 3-inch thick dry pine needles and leaves, causing an ignition that ignites the roof. Simple things also like ember-proof vents. Those old attic coarse wire mesh vents, embers will just get driven right through those by the winds that drive the flames. In most homes that burn in wildland fires do not come in contact with the fire itself while the home is intact. In fact, they're already in flaming ruins by the time the fire reaches the town. The reason for that is that most homes that burn in wildfires are ignited by the embers that are driven by the winds, sometimes a mile, 2 miles, or even more in advance of the flames. And so you need to protect homes against those embers. And then, of course, when the fire gets there, you need to make sure that it doesn't burn actively right up to the wall of the house. And that's where defensible space pruning comes in. But it's not about removing mature trees. It's about removing lower limbs. It's about removing dry grasses and accumulations of twigs and dry leaves and things like that. Really small diameter kindling-like material. And interestingly, beyond 100 feet from homes, there's no additional benefit from vegetation management in terms of protecting homes. You're literally doing nothing additional to protect homes when you go beyond that 100-foot zone. And oftentimes it's just 60 feet. So I want to talk about a couple of examples of what happens when we go out into the forest wildlands and we remove a bunch of carbon from the forests, most of which, as we know, goes into the atmosphere when trees are removed from the forest. Most of that does not end up in a lumber product somewhere. Most of it ends up in the atmosphere. So we're making climate change worse when we're removing these trees. And then the question is, well, does it protect communities? Does it really act as a fuel break, a fire break? Does it stop the fires? One of the most tragic examples is the Camp Fire of 2018. It burned in November of 2018 in an area in the northern Sierra Nevada that's one of the most heavily logged areas in the entire northern Sierra Nevada. The area between the point of origin of the Camp Fire and the town of Paradise, several thousand acres, had been heavily logged in the years before the Camp Fire occurred. Many acres of commercial thinning, so-called, post-fire logging done under the guise of fuel reduction, dead trees removed, live trees removed by the thousands and thousands, all under the guise of fuel reduction and fire management and fuel breaks. The message that the community was hearing from the logging industry and the United States Forest Service was, this is going to save you from wildfires. This is going to make the fire burn so slowly and at such low intensity that we'll easily be able to put it out and suppress it, and it won't reach the town. The problem is twofold. Number one, it gives people a false sense of security. They're not doing their defensible space work. They're not doing the home hardening work because they think that they don't have to worry because that logging project far away from town out there over the ridge will somehow stop the fire. What actually happened was very, very different. The fire was driven by hot, dry, windy conditions, which is what drives wildfires. Mostly it's weather and climate, and therefore climate change. It's not about the vegetation mostly, but to the extent the vegetation matters, it matters in the opposite direction from what most people think. When you remove vegetation from forests, when you remove trees, you actually can often make the fires burn hotter and faster. You change the microclimate of the forest. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. But what happened here in Paradise is that, the areas that were most heavily logged is what the fire burned through fastest and most intensely. And as a consequence, it reached the town of Paradise 2 or 3 hours earlier than it probably otherwise would have. And people had very little time to evacuate. Over 14,000 homes were burned and 86 people lost their lives. And that was preventable. That didn't have to happen. If we focus on home hardening and defensible space, we're seeing example after example where over 99% of homes will survive, even a very intense fire, and everyone gets out safely. If we have evacuation assistance, evacuation planning, and the home hardening and defensible space work. But communities need the assistance. This is the Caldor fire that burned just last year in the northern Sierra Nevada. And you can see those yellow and orange areas. Those are the orange areas, light and dark orange. Those are logging areas. Most of that's commercial thinning. And people had this idea that if you remove a bunch of trees from the forest, it's going to make fires burn less intensely because it's removing fuel. It doesn't work that way. Unfortunately, it actually makes fires burn faster and more intensely most of the time. There's variability at local scales, but most of the time that's what happens. If you look at the left side, the western side of this fire, you'll see there a little town of Grizzly Flats. You'll see the little name there. Thousands of acres were thinned around the town of Grizzly Flats, and thinning is just commercial logging. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But that's what the fire burned through fastest and most intensely, and most of Grizzly Flats is now gone. Whereas on the other side of the fire, in the Tahoe Basin, people had done the home hardening. They had done the defensible space, and most of them could afford to do that. And as a consequence, those homes survived. Very, very different circumstances on the east side and the west side of the fire. Sort of a tale of two cities situation. Dixie Fire burned last year in the northern Sierra Nevada, further north, almost 1 million acres. And you can see again those orange and kind of dark yellow and orange areas. Those are logged areas. And a lot of that is commercial thinning. Once again, some of it's post-fire logging. And this was all done under the guise or rubric of fuel reduction. These are the areas that the fire tended to burn through most rapidly and often most intensely. And right in the center of the fire is the town of Greenville. This is a place I know well. And people in the town were given the message that these logging projects out there on the ridge, far away from town, are going to stop the fire. They're fuel breaks, these commercial thinning projects on public lands, on private lands. And the fire burned through those most intensely, most rapidly, and it burned down most of Greenville. Now most of Greenville's gone. And that's, again, this is preventable stuff. It doesn't have to be this way. So I want to talk a little bit about the science and what it really is telling us, because fundamentally, and this is going to be a running theme in my talk here tonight, is that the science is fundamentally good news. It's positive news. It's hopeful news, because there is a path forward, both for climate solutions and for biodiversity and for communities. But we're going to have to make some shifts, and we're going to have to hold industries and elected officials, both Democrats and Republicans, we're going to have to hold them accountable. Okay, so one of the key misconceptions is if you have dense forests, they're going to burn more intensely. The idea being they've got more fuel accumulation. If it's a mature forest with more trees, more biomass. The reality is we have studied this over and over and over again. And when scientists, including myself, but not limited to me, lots of other scientists have looked at this. Whenever we look at this specifically, what we find is that when forests are denser, they tend to burn at equal or lower intensities, not higher intensities. Sure, on any given stand level, a small scale, weather is going to dictate what happens there. And a dense forest can burn at low, moderate, or high intensity. But on average, they tend to burn lower intensities. Interestingly, forests that have not burned in a very long time, if they haven't burned in 75 years or 100 years, the assumption out there, and we hear this all the time in the media, is that while there's fuel accumulation, the forests are too dense, they're overgrown, and therefore when a fire occurs, they're going to burn at unnatural severities. They're going to burn much more severely. What we're finding again and again and again, and I've published multiple studies on this and so have others, the overwhelming weight of scientific evidence is telling us that forests that haven't burned in the longest period of time, which tend to be denser, they actually experience equal or lower intensity fire when wildfires occur. And this is just one of those studies. That bar on the graph on the right is time since fire. TSF is time since fire. That's forests that haven't burned in more than 75 years. And that black bar at the bottom, that's the percent high severity. And you can see that that black bar is narrower than forests that have burned more recently. And narrower means less high intensity fire. Similar results in the study I published in 2008 with the late Dennis Odian, and other studies have found this as well. So what is going on there? How is this possible? Because it's so different from what we hear and what we've assumed. It's so different from what seems intuitively correct and obvious to us. And the reality is this: forest fires are driven overwhelmingly by weather and climate change. If you have a drought year and you have hot, dry, windy conditions and you get an ignition, guess what? You're going to have a significant fire, and you're not going to be able to suppress it. You're not going to be able to put it out because the weather's in control. when we're trying to spending 50 or 100 or $1 million or more trying to suppress these wind and climate driven fires during these hot, dry, windy conditions and drought years, we're literally trying to fight the wind. That's how futile it is. Once those fires get going, you can't suppress them. They're going to stop, and they're going to slow and stop when the weather changes. And I'm a co-author of the largest scientific analysis ever done on this question. Bradley et al. 2016. We published that in the journal Ecosphere. And we looked at the whole Western US, 3 decades of data, millions and millions of acres of fires. And what we found is that 2 things. Number 1, weather and climate variables were dominant in wildfires. But number 2, forest protection was a significant secondary factor, but not in the way people think. Forests with the fewest environmental protections and the most tree removal actually burned the most intensely. So the more trees you remove from the forest and the more you roll back environmental laws, the faster and hotter fires tend to burn, oftentimes toward towns. This is just one more study finding that yes, sometimes thinned areas burn at low intensity, but oftentimes and even more often they burn at high intensity, which is those bars going to the right. And so, people oftentimes they'll find an area in a forest that burned after a fire, and in a fire, and an area that burned at low intensity that happened to be thinned before, and they'll think, okay, well, thinning works, but they're forgetting that there might be more examples in the opposite direction, further into that fire, and that's what we're finding is typically the case. The places where thinned areas burn more intensely are more common than the opposite result. And that's what I found in a study I just published just a few months ago regarding the Creek Fire, a 380,000 acre fire in the southern Sierra Nevada that burned in 2020. I found that forests that had so-called fuel reduction logging under the guise of fuel reduction, which is commercial thinning and post-fire logging, those forests burned more intensely than forests with no forest management history. They actually burned more intensely than forests that had previous fire. They burned more intensely than forests that had a lot of dead trees and down logs, but no logging history. And so dense forests with lots of live trees, lots of dead trees, lots of down logs, they do not burn more intensely when wildfires occur. In fact, they tend to burn less intensely. So again, the question, why is that? And it really comes down to microclimate. A dense, mature forest has, on one hand, yes, it has more biomass, but it also has higher canopy cover. And higher canopy cover gives that forest more cooling shade. And that means that everything on the forest floor and in the understory stays more shaded, more cool, more moist during fire season. Not only that, but denser forests actually act as a windbreak against the gusts of wind that drive the flames, simply because there's so many tree stems. And so they can actually reduce and will reduce the speed of the winds, and that reduces the speed and intensity of the fires, typically. So there are countervailing factors in a dense forest. And on balance, what it means is because of that cool, moist, shaded microclimate, they tend to burn at lower intensities. But when logging occurs, including commercial thinning, it reduces that cooling shade of the forest canopy cover. It creates hotter, drier, and windier conditions. And logging equipment spreads highly combustible invasive grasses like cheatgrass, all of which basically makes fires typically burn faster and hotter through those logged areas. Now, when people hear the term thinning, a lot of people think pruning shears, and they don't think chainsaws and bulldozers. The vast majority of the cases, what thinning really means is industrial logging. The typical thinning project kills and removes upwards of 70 or 80% of the trees in a given stand, including mature trees and old growth trees, many of them. And so a lot of carbon is removed from the forest, most of which goes into the atmosphere and makes climate change worse. And many of the mature fire-resistant trees are removed. And basically what you have is a situation where there's almost no understory left, and much of the carbon, in many cases, most of the carbon has been removed from the forest, and most of that ends up again in the atmosphere. So one of the other key aspects of the overgrown forest myth is that dead trees make fires burn more intensely. And we've studied this again and again as well. The overwhelming weight of scientific evidence finds that forests with more dead trees and down logs do not burn more intensely. Some of the research, including this one here, this is Meigs et al. 2016, some of the research finds that those forests burn at lower intensities, not higher. Now, again, how can that be? Because people have this idea, if a fire occurs in a forest and you've got a lot of dead trees and down logs, they just combust and they're sort of explosive. It doesn't work that way. Live trees and dead trees, they'll get scorched on the outer surface, but they don't really combust for the most part. If a down log is very, very well decayed, it can mostly combust by smoldering long after the flames have passed. But most of the dead wood even doesn't even combust in forest fires, and only a tiny percentage of the live trees gets combusted. Bottom line is that live trees and dead trees are mostly repositories of moisture, of water. They act like much more like giant sponges than they do like fuel. And I studied this in my creek fire study, and I found that forests with more dead trees and down logs did not burn more intensely. They actually had some of the lowest levels of fire intensity in forests that had no logging history. And so dead trees and down logs are not the issue. In fact, down logs, when those dead trees, those snags, when they fall, they can soak up and will soak up 25 times more water than the surrounding soil. They can retain and hold 25 times more water per area of volume than the surrounding soil, even in a drought year. And so it's remarkable, the water retention in these structures. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit also about the next big myth. I talk a lot about this in my book, Smokescreen, which I call the Catastrophic Wildfire Myth. And it's another myth that is basically used to promote and further the existing logging programs. And it forms a political justification to promote and increase logging that's making climate change worse. And the myth goes something like this, that the fires are burning so hot now because of fuel accumulation, because our forests are overgrown, that the fires are burning so hot now, they kill all the wildlife habitat, they destroy all the forests, they sterilize the soil, and nothing can grow afterwards unless we intervene with the post-fire logging and artificial planting and herbicide spraying. That's the myth. The reality is extremely different. Interestingly, no matter how big the forest fires are, these days, they're still mostly low and moderate intensity. In other words, most of the area that burns in these fires, even the really big ones, is in areas where you may kill some small trees and some number of mature trees, but most of the trees survive and remain green and alive. And only a portion of the fire burns at high intensity. This is a fire intensity map of the rim fire. Those red areas there are the high intensity fire patches where fire kills most or all of the trees. And the green and the yellow are areas where most of the trees survive, especially the mature trees. Those red areas are only 19.9% of the fire. It looks like more because red is so visually arresting, but the reality is that, and that's its own problem, it's sort of a bias in the mapping. But the fact is that it's only about 20% high intensity fire in this fire. This is an even bigger fire. This is the Wallow Fire of 2011 in Arizona, 565,000 acre fire, less than 10% high intensity. And we see this again and again. Most of these fires are strongly dominated by low and moderate intensity fire effects. There's variability. Sometimes high intensity can be 30 or 40%. Sometimes it's only 5 or 10%. Usually it's around 20 or 25%. And sometimes up to 30 or so. Historically, the percentages were pretty similar. 20 to 35% of any given fire on average was often high intensity fire, long before fire suppression and logging. The main difference is that we just have less fire now in our forests overall, because most of the ignitions are suppressed at the only time when they can be suppressed, which is during low fire weather, when it's relatively cool and you don't have high winds and it's fairly moist conditions, and you get a lightning strike and an ignition and the fire's basically not moving. It's easy to put that out. You can put it out with your boots. And that's when most fires are actually suppressed. But when you have hot, dry, windy conditions, any ignition that happens, the fire is going to immediately start moving more quickly and you won't be able to stop it. And so because of fire suppression during low fire weather, we have just a lot less fire in our forests. Now, interestingly, another one of the aspects of the catastrophic wildfire myth is this idea that historically, there were very few trees in our forests. We had very, very open and park-like forests, and that we have far more trees in our forests now. And I talk a lot about this in Smokescreen and kind of deconstruct it, but just one example here. There was a whole series of studies by US Forest Service scientists. And for those of you who don't know, the United States Forest Service is in the commercial logging business. The #1 land management activity they engage in is selling public trees to private logging companies and keeping the revenue from those timber sales for the agency's budget. So they're literally in the commercial logging business, and a lot of the things they promote kind of reflect that. This is one example. And so these Forest Service scientists produced these studies, and they claimed that they had century-old forest survey data that said the forests were very, very open and very low density. Well, I asked these scientists for the data, and they refused to give it to me, which is not the way things work typically between scientists. That piqued my curiosity. So I went to the National Archives. I spent many, many long months there and doing the research in the same old file boxes. And I found that they had excluded most of the data. When we included all the data, including all the data on small trees that was left out by the Forest Service studies, we found that historical tree densities were 17 times higher than the Forest Service reported in ponderosa pine forests, and they were 7 times higher in mixed conifer forests than the Forest Service reported in terms of trees per acre. So there were open forests, and there were also very dense forests. There was a lot of variability. This is just a map of fire severity. This was done by old US Geological Survey research back in the late 1800s. And those white polygons with the cross hatching, those are large high-intensity fire patches that were mapped by the US Geological Survey researchers in the northern Sierra Nevada over the course of 8 years, well over a century ago. And you look at the scale of this map, you can see that many of these are thousands of acres in size, and some of them are actually tens of thousands of acres in size. Point is that we always had a mix of fire intensities, but when we did have high-intensity fire patches, some of them were actually quite large. And this quote from that same report reflects that. These dense old stands of live trees next to areas where it was mostly standing snags and regenerating chaparral and young conifers growing up through the chaparral. And that's that kind of mix, that heterogeneity that is natural in our forests, and we should celebrate. And the reason it's important is because a lot of species, a lot of native wildlife species have evolved to depend on just post-fire habitat, but also areas that burn hot, where fire kills most or all the trees. And I know this is counterintuitive, seemingly on the surface. It may seem that way, but it turns out that this unique habitat that's created by patches of high-intensity fire in our forests, we call this snag forest habitat. And it is actually comparable to old growth forest in terms of native biodiversity and wildlife abundance. Many native species have evolved to depend on this habitat. And this is just one example of this. I took this picture at 12 years post-fire. This is snag forest habitat in the El Dorado National Forest in the Star Fire that burned in 2001. And you see, standing snags, down logs, naturally regenerating shrubs and conifers and oaks and dogwood. This is a very complex, rich ecosystem. And it turns out that small mammals are incredibly abundant in snag forest habitat because of those shrub patches and the down logs and the dense young pockets of regenerating conifers. It's great habitat. And in fact, small mammal prey biomass is 2 to 6 times higher in the snag forest than it is in unburned or lightly burned old forest. And that is great news for hawks and owls like spotted owls, and also carnivores like Pacific fisher. So it means they've got lots of food. Native flowering shrubs their growth is stimulated by high intensity fire, and they proliferate in ways that they simply can't in low and moderate intensity areas. And those flowering shrubs and wildflowers attract flying insects, native flying insects, and that provides food for fly-catching birds and bats. And not only do the fly-catching birds and bats have more food, but you also have a lot of shrub nesting birds that are abundant in the shrubs that grow in naturally and proliferate after high-intensity fire. And of course, then there's the cavity nesting species like woodpeckers and bluebirds. And one of those here shown here is the blackback woodpecker. I've been studying this species for about 2 decades now. And blackback woodpeckers are strongly dependent on dense mature forest that burns at a mostly high intensity in large patches. Typically, one pair of blackback woodpeckers will have a territory 200 or 300 acres in size, sometimes larger. And the reason is that when fires occur, they send up heat and smoke. And there are dozens of native species of wood-boring beetles that have evolved to depend on recently fire-killed trees to reproduce. And they've evolved receptors in their bodies to detect heat or smoke from wildfires. And they're pretty good flyers. They're big beetles. They fly right to the fire. They'll land on the charred bark of a fire-killed tree not long after the flames have passed and the tree is cooled. And they lay their eggs, and the larvae develop and bore through the charred bark into the wood of the tree. And they develop there over time into adults, and then emerge as adults, and then go through another cycle in the dead trees. And then, of course, at a certain point, we'll fly away and find the new next fire. While those larvae are in the snags, in these standing fire-killed trees, that's the primary food source for a number of native woodpecker species, including the blackback woodpecker, that have evolved to depend on the larva as their primary food source. So one blackback woodpecker will eat about 13,500 wood-boring beetle larvae every single year. You need a lot of dead trees to support that. And the cool thing about blackback woodpeckers, along with some of their evolutionary cousin species, is that they're keystone species in the ecosystem. They create nest cavities and homes for other species in the forest. Not only are these dead trees full of food for woodpeckers and other species, but they're also softer than live trees. And so the woodpeckers can excavate nest cavities more easily in the dead trees. And one pair of woodpeckers, they'll create 2 to 4 nest cavities every single year, even in the same territory. And all the ones that they don't use in a given year are available to all the other cavity nesting species in the forest that need cavities to raise their young every year and reproduce, but cannot create their own. Bluebirds, nuthatches, chipmunks, flying squirrels, dozens and dozens of bird and small mammal species in the forest that have to have the woodpeckers to create homes for them. But the woodpeckers can't do that unless they've got a lot of dead trees and a lot of food in those dead trees. And of course, the food can't be there because if you don't have patches of dead trees that create the habitat for the wood-boring beetles to reproduce. So you need these natural disturbance processes to actually create the habitat for the beetles that creates the food and the habitat for the woodpeckers that creates the habitat for the bluebirds and the nuthatches. And so it's this really rich, complex, interconnected ecosystem. And the other interesting thing about blackback woodpeckers is that they're beautifully and perfectly camouflaged through countless millennia of evolution in the snag forest. They're camouflaged against the charred bark of fire-killed trees because blackback woodpeckers are completely black on their backs. And just take a moment and see if you can find the blackback woodpecker in this picture. It's a female blackback woodpecker. I was standing about 20, 25 feet from her when I took the picture. I was very close. The tip of the arrow is touching the top of her head. And that just gives you a sense of how perfectly and elegantly camouflaged the blackback woodpeckers are, how wonderfully adapted evolutionarily they are to this habitat. This is their home. This is what they do best. And this is a male blackback woodpecker feeding a chick in the Angora fire in South Lake Tahoe area. Well, it's not just blackback woodpeckers, lots of species like the snag forest. And this is just one among many, many studies that I discuss in my book, Smokescreen. Many species involved here, but the bottom line is as fire intensity goes up, so too does bird abundance and diversity typically? And this is just one study reflecting that. And so you often find your highest levels of total bird abundance and diversity in the areas that burn most intensely. Spotted owls are one of the species that really like the snag forest habitat for foraging. They nest and roost in dense, mature, and old forests that burn more lightly, but they go out of their way to forage in the snag forest habitat because they eat the small mammals, and the small mammal prey are most abundant in the snag forest. Now, we did a study on this and found out, well, what happens if you do post-fire logging in those snag forests? Well, it turns out even a relatively small amount of post-fire logging causes the owl populations to plummet because you're taking away their key hunting grounds. Now, before fire suppression, we actually had quite a bit more wildfire in this country. And so it's another key aspect of this catastrophic wildfire myth is that current levels of fire are unprecedented. Well, that's not true in forests. In certain ecosystems, we do have too much fire, like Southern California's Chaparral. Mostly that's because of unplanned human ignitions in population centers right next to the Chaparral ecosystems. And there's lots of things we can do to curb that and rein that in. And we need to do that. But in forest ecosystems, we still have less fire than we had historically. Now, interestingly, when fires occur in our forests, only a small percentage of the live tree carbon is actually consumed. Less than 3%, typically, even in the high intensity fire patches, and far less in the low and moderate intensity patches. And so all of the current models, wildfire models, are greatly overstating and overestimating and exaggerating the carbon emissions from wildfires every single year. And none of those models account for post-fire regrowth of vegetation, including trees, and all the carbon sequestration that goes along with that. Bottom line is, much less carbon is consumed in forest fires than we think, and therefore much less carbon is emitted. And that amount of carbon is very quickly recouped because of all the nutrient cycling from the fire and all the vigorous post-fire regrowth. And this is me and Dr. James Hansen, a climate scientist. We teamed up to fight a large post-fire logging project on the Stanislaus National Forest, public lands, in the Sierra Nevada. This is the rim fire. We took this picture at 8 years post-fire. This was just last year. And this is one among many areas where the U.S. Forest Service is telling the public that the forests were destroyed by catastrophic wildfire. It was a high-intensity fire patch. The live trees are too far away. The forest won't regenerate. And what they have to do is clear cut the forest, incinerate the trees for biomass energy in biomass plants down in the foothills in Central Valley, and then spray herbicides and artificially plant. They're telling the public that if they don't do this, they won't see any forest regrowth for hundreds of years in these areas. Well, the reality is the forest is already naturally regenerating. As you can see, a lot of these trees are already 7 or 8 feet tall or taller. And that's me on the right side there, and the other Dr. Hansen on my right, to the left of the image. And you see there's hundreds of naturally regenerating conifers per acre in here. There's no planting happened here and no post-fire logging. But right next to this area is the same high intensity fire patch, the same stand of forest, but this area was post-fire logged years earlier, and it was planted. And most of what they planted died. The post-fire logging removed the shade, it removed the nutrients, the logging equipment damaged and compacted the soils, and it brought in a lot of invasive grasses, which is mostly what you have here. It's just stumps and invasive grasses. Very few of the trees they planted survived. Another area, this is very typical. This is one of the interior of one of the largest high-intensity fire patches in the rim fire. This is over 1,000 feet away from the nearest live surviving tree. And yet, at just 8 years post-fire, you have hundreds of naturally regenerating conifer seedlings and saplings per acre. Many of these are over 12 feet tall, just for perspective in this picture. Right next door, where post-fire logging and artificial planting occurred, you have essentially a barren wasteland because of all the damage. Some trees they planted survived, many do not, and there's just so much damage. And of course, the carbon they removed from when they removed these trees, because they burn these trees for energy production, that carbon is in the atmosphere now. It's what we call clear cuts for kilowatts, and it is a climate change nightmare. Many of you may know this, but burning trees or portions of trees for energy produces even more CO2 than burning coal for equal energy produced, about 30 or 40% more, in fact. And so it is the last thing we should be doing is turning to our forests and our trees like giant sticks of coal and treating them like an energy source. That is about the most regressive and counterproductive thing we could do. Now, interestingly, giant sequoias, I know there's been a lot of media coverage recently about giant sequoias and the recent fires. You know, no one bothered to study what happens if giant sequoias burn in a larger high intensity fire patch. Well, I've got a paper in peer review right now. I'm doing that very thing. And it turns out that's where the best and most vigorous natural regeneration of giant sequoias is. This is actually in the middle of this picture. This is a high intensity fire patch, and those are all giant sequoia seedlings and saplings. Some of those are about 5 feet tall already at just 4 years post-fire. And in the same fire, in a low intensity fire patch, there's almost no giant sequoia reproduction whatsoever. It's almost totally absent. Giant sequoias have been slowly dying off over the last century because of fire suppression, mostly because of the lack of moderate and high intensity fire. You want that mix of fire intensities. It's natural. And so we shouldn't lament if some portion of the fire burns at moderate or high intensity in the giant sequoia groves. That's been that's been going on for millions of years in these groves, and they're adapted to it. So the question is, I know there's a lot of conversation about fires in Southern California forests and in our Southern California mountains. And of course, I live in Southern California mountains. My wife and I are in the Big Bear City area. And it turns out basically the same lessons hold and apply here too. Historically, there were low and moderate intensity fire patches, and there were also some high intensity fire patches, including some big ones. This is a photo of a 1933 fire on Big Pine Mountain in the Los Padres National Forest, north of Los Angeles. Large high intensity fire patch. One of the interesting things is when we see fires happen now, oftentimes we think there's more high intensity fire than there really is. And that's because a lot of the trees, especially pine trees, that look dead initially after a fire are actually not dead. And you see in that upper left image, that's a picture that I took just months after the lake fire that burned in 2015 on the San Bernardino National Forest. Those trees look dead. There's no green needles there, just brown needles. And then the lower right is the same stand. I took that a year after. And that's because of what I call flushing. And I actually published the first paper on this back in 2009. Flushing is basically when the heat from the fire kills all the needles, but the buds at the end of the branches survive, and they just produce new green needles the next year, a year after the fire. And this is a close-up picture of flushing just starting in a ponderosa pine tree. And so again, a lot of the trees that looked dead initially are not. And of course, just like the Sierra Nevada and other parts in the West, even the big fires, they burn mostly at low and moderate intensity. This is a picture of a low intensity area in the mountain fire that burned in 2013 in the San Jacinto Mountains above Idlewild. And we find the same thing as well in Southern California mountains with regard to spotted owls, for example. They nest and roost in the more low intensity or moderate intensity burn areas, and they go out of their way to hunt and forage in the snag forest patches. We call this the bed and breakfast effect. And same thing with the woodpeckers. The woodpeckers drill through the charred bark of the fire-killed trees and get those big wood-boring beetle larvae that they need for their food. And that's what this is. It kind of looks like someone shot the tree up with a rifle. That's actually the woodpeckers going in and foraging, drilling through the bark and getting those wood-boring beetles. This is also in the mountain fire at the edge of a high-intensity fire patch. This is me in the lake fire in the Aspen Grove in Fish Creek, in the Fish Creek drainage. And the aspens, of course, benefit tremendously from high intensity fire in particular. They really do need that to effectively reproduce and maintain themselves on the landscape. Otherwise, the conifers just get so tall and the canopy cover closes and they start to die back, which is what was happening before this fire occurred. And just like the Sierra Nevada, there's lots of natural conifer regeneration. This is the mountain fire. At 4 years post-fire, in this area, I found post-fire regeneration of conifers was 73 per acre, and the pre-fire density was only 51 per acre. So there are actually more trees post-fire than pre-fire. Same thing in the lower elevation conifer forests of the mountain fire, down in the May Valley area. More trees per acre after the fire than before the fire. Now, I'm going to talk just briefly before we go to Q&A about some of the key climate change impacts that I think may surprise a lot of people. In this country, what the science is telling us, and these are data from Harris et al. 2016, is that logging in United States forests emits 10 times more carbon every year than fire and tree mortality from native beetles combined. Logging is the real carbon bomb, not fires or beetles. And a lot of folks don't realize that we actually do more logging in this country than any other country on the planet. And as a consequence, we actually are responsible for more carbon emissions from logging every year than any other country on the planet. We're the biggest global culprit, and that means we have the biggest global responsibility to change our practices. It's also true of commercial thinning. Commercial logging conducted under the guise of thinning emits 3 times more carbon per acre than wildfire alone. That's from Campbell et al. 2012. And the reason is simple, is that when any tree that's removed from the forest, the branches and the treetops, which make up a large portion of the carbon in the tree, those are not usable for lumber, of course. Those get hauled to a biomass facility and incinerated for energy production. And that carbon goes into the atmosphere. And then the log itself gets hauled to a timber mill, but the bark is not usable for lumber. And the round parts are not usable for dimensional lumber. And then, of course, the saw blades go through all over the place and take out a lot of the wood as well. And what you have left is only a minor portion, 20, 25, 30% of the tree oftentimes, and that's it. And the rest is incinerated at the lumber mill for energy production as what they call hog fuel. So again, carbon into the atmosphere. And so you only have a very relatively minor portion of the carbon ends up in a wood product somewhere in a structure. And even then, that's not permanent. And of course, logging reduces the carbon sequestration and storage capacity of forests by compacting and damaging soils, by removing nutrients, and by removing mature trees and removing their carbon sequestration capacity from the ecosystem. So over 200 US climate scientists and ecologists, including myself, recently told Congress that in order to overcome the climate crisis, we have to move away from fossil fuels and substantially increase protection of our forests in order to actually start drawing down atmospheric carbon and reduce those dangerously excessive atmospheric carbon concentrations. So I will stop sharing there, and would be very happy to answer questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hanson. I just want to acknowledge that this is our biggest crowd to show up. And so we were talking about this before the talk. We had a lot of people RSVP, and we really appreciate all of you showing up for this really important talk. Merrill was able to go out and upgrade our Zoom account to get all of you in the room. So this is fantastic. And a lot of you seem to be very knowledgeable too, as I'm reading through what we're seeing in the chat. We've got some ringers in here, people that know about forestry came to show up and hear and learn and support the work that you're doing. So thank you very much, Dr. Hanson. I'm going to start off with a question that I'm trying to do these mostly in the order that they came in, and then also give some deference to folks that may have asked only once versus folks that asked a few questions. But Larry asked about thinning. Can this be turned back? Is there any progress in doing this?
We are making progress. I think that we have quite a ways to go. And the main thing that's getting in the way is, of course, the myths. I mean, there's a lot of really good people in the environmental community, among policymakers, in the press, who have just believed the misinformation coming from the Forest Service and the logging industry. And so they think, well, we need to remove trees from the forest in order to stop these fires. And they don't like it, but they think, well, it's a bitter pill we have to swallow. And so the more we actually confront these misconceptions and these myths, and frankly, the political and economic incentives that are driving them, the more progress that we make and the more headway we make. And so, yes, I think that there's lots of hope and there's lots of progress more to make, but we already have made some progress, but we could certainly use more help.
Okay, thank you. Another question, have you studied, and this isn't something you covered, but I thought I'd ask it, have you studied afforestation? The idea of planting new forests where none existed before. Is that something that we are succeeding at or anyone succeeding at?
Yeah, good question. So, what the current climate science is really telling us is that the most effective way by far for forests to help mitigate the climate crisis is by what we call pro-forestation. And Dr. Bill Moomaw published a great paper on that in 2019. He's a multiple IPCC co-author and climate scientist from Tufts University. And pro-forestation basically is protecting existing forests so that they can absorb more CO2 and sort of maximize their carbon storage potential. That's where you get your biggest bang for the buck overwhelmingly. Planting trees, unfortunately, it doesn't really give you much climate change mitigation payoff for quite a long time, even decades, because it takes the trees a long time to get to a size where they're really going to start sequestering a lot of carbon. We don't want to plant trees in places that are not naturally forested. I think that what we do want, though, is to make sure to recover native forests in places where native forests have been lost due to forest clearing and past deforestation for agriculture and livestock, for example. There's been some really cool research indicating that in most cases, the best way to do that is simply removing the adverse impact, removing the livestock grazing and stop clearing the forest. And nature will naturally recover and revegetate native forest in those areas. There can always be exceptions. Some areas are so far away from any intact forest that nature might need a helping hand. But I would say the research is indicating those are exceptions and not the rule. In most cases, it's really about kind of passive rewilding.
Thank you. Stuart asked, can you please tell us a reference to show that the mass majority of California's $2 billion wildfire management plan is going to forests, not folks? I'm not sure if I understood that, but maybe you did.
I do, yeah, and it's a great question, and thank you for asking it. There's been some really wonderful work on this done by the California Chaparral Institute, Rick Halsey, also by Los Padres Forest Watch and others. We've done work on this too, but and they'll have the most specific and up-to-date numbers, but the bottom line is this. The most recent update that I heard was that basically of that money, only 3% of it was going to home hardening and defensible space. Only 3% going to the only things that are proven by science to effectively protect homes and lives from wildfire. And the vast majority of it is going to logging projects out in wildlands, to mastication projects in Chaparral, destroying Chaparral in the name of fuel breaks. And of course, the tragedy is that not only is that taking the carbon from these ecosystems, from forests and Chaparral, and putting it in the atmosphere, but also, for the reasons I described earlier, it's not stopping fires. In fact, the fires are often burning faster and hotter through those so-called fuel breaks.
Thank you. Lenore asked, what do you think about Native American burning before 1492? Do they prevent big wildfires?
Yeah, this is a great question and a really important question. There's lots of information on this from scientific studies on fire history, from Native American scholars and practitioners of cultural burning. And basically what it all means is this. Before fire suppression, before logging, before colonization, both mixed intensity wildfires from lightning strikes and Native American cultural burning, they were both more common, quite a bit more common than they are today. Both have been suppressed, both have been marginalized. And I have made the argument in many places and continue to, make the argument that we need more of both. And we need to remove administrative and political barriers to Native American cultural burning, just in the same way we need to remove administrative and political barriers to what I call managed wildfires, letting more lightning strikes burn in the more remote forests.
Thank you. John asks, why doesn't Sierra Pacific do controlled burns on their property?
Good question. Sierra Pacific is not really, Sierra Pacific Industries, for those who don't know, it's a very large logging corporation in California. Sierra Pacific Industries is really not in, their priority is not managing wildfires. Their priority is removing as many trees as they can and profiting from those trees. And in fact, when wildfires do occur, Sierra Pacific Industries, under current exemptions in the state forest practices law, those exemptions allow Sierra Pacific Industries and other logging corporations to immediately cut down vast swaths of forests, including areas that are just lightly burned, under the guise of removing dead or dying trees. And they don't have to do a timber harvest plan. There's no public comment. There's no public notice. There's no environmental analysis of impacts to the climate or the ecosystems. And so this is something that needs to be reformed. And our state legislators need to hear from the public that these loopholes, these logging loopholes in the state forest practices law, they need to be closed. But anyway, the bottom line is that SPI is really very much focused on removing trees from forests, not restoring fire.
Thank you. Tara asks, can you comment on the statewide fire management plans, such as CAL FIRE's statewide vegetation treatment plan and/or the California Natural Resources Agency's proposed draft natural and working lands climate smart strategy?
Sure. There's a lot there to unpack, and we don't have the time to get into the details, but I'll just tell you this, that the plans being proposed by California state agencies and by including CAL FIRE are overwhelmingly focused on removing vegetation from wildlands, especially logging, but also mastication of chaparral, under the guise of reducing fuels and creating fuel breaks. Very, very little is going to the one thing that we know will actually protect communities from fire, which is home hardening and defensible space. That needs to change. That's where nearly all of the money should be going. But right now, the agencies are still pursuing essentially, the logging industry agenda, and they need to be held accountable. And whether a legislator is a Democrat or Republican, if they're doing the wrong thing, we really need to hold them accountable and make sure that they change course.
Thank you. Kimberly asks, why do industry claims and assertions get traction in policy circles? Too bad small groups have to prove every assertion and myth wrong.
Yeah, well, it comes down to money. The logging industry makes a lot of money doing logging, and a certain portion of that money they use for two things. They use for media work, to get their message out there as loudly and as frequently as possible in the media, and also for campaign contributions to state and federal legislators, both Democrat and Republican. And so I think we really need to follow the money on this. And again, hold politicians accountable regardless of party if they're taking money from the logging industry and if they're parroting the industry's message, and including the message of the U.S. Forest Service, which, as I mentioned earlier, is actually part of the logging industry.
Thank you.
Which, by the way, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention, one key thing that we can do is urge federal legislators to change that and protect our national forests and get the U.S. Forest Service out of the logging business.
Thank you. Lois, I understand you want to ask a question. Please put it in the chat. I am trying to do these and pull them all out of the chat. So if you have a question, please put it in the chat. I will read it out. Gilbert asks, does that mean, I think this is in reference to the fact that you mentioned that there's a lot of moisture in those logs on the forest floor. Does that mean that the dead logs take 30% of the forest water?
Well, I was comparing the down logs to the water in the soil, but there's also a lot of water in the live trees. Of course, live trees are about half water. And so there's enormous amounts of water in the forest ecosystem, especially if it's a denser forest with lots of live trees, lots of dead trees, lots of down logs, lots of shrubs. All of that is basically, moisture retention and water retention in the system. So the main comparison I was making was between the down logs and the surrounding soil.
Okay, thank you. Larry asked, the Board of Forestry has oversight for CAL FIRE, whether or not they have evaluated how whether or not they have evaluated how logging and type of logging is a factor in promoting wind-driven, high-severity wildfires. They've been silent on this. Why is that? Why is it that the widespread of logging all over private industry and national forests is not part of the conversation when trying to solve the problem is reducing severe wildfires?
Yeah, I mean, this is a conversation that we need to have as a society. We need to raise our voices, and everyone does, so that we're not just drowned out by all the money coming from the logging industry and the Forest Service that's trying to tell the public and reporters and policymakers that the answer is more logging. What we know from study after study now, there's a large and growing body of research telling us that that removing trees from forests is not going to stop weather and climate-driven fires, and it often makes them burn more intensely. But this is not a message that the industry wants to embrace, because if they did embrace it, they'd have to do less logging, or we'd have to protect more forests and not log areas at all in many places, acquire more private forest lands into protected public ownership, protect our state forest lands from logging, like Jackson State Forest, which needs to be protected. It's being logged right now. This is being subsidized by taxpayers, on public and public lands, and both state and federal, and this is something that needs to stop. But ultimately, the public is going to have to we're going to have to raise our voices and make sure that that elected officials actually do the right thing.
So you made a strong argument that we need to reduce or stop logging and try to resist forest management. Is there any point in worsening climate crisis where excessive new heat and drought change all the rules about whether or not California forests can rebound from fire?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really, really important question. I am fundamentally optimistic about the future, and I say this in my book, Smokescreen. And the reason I'm optimistic is that I believe we are going to turn the corner on the climate crisis. It's not going to happen overnight. We've already seen damage from the climate crisis. We're going to see more. So, a certain amount of consequences already set in motion. But I do believe we're going to avoid the worst impacts of the climate crisis, because I believe more and more people will start understanding and embracing the science and communicating the science to elected officials, so that we can start shifting away from fossil fuels in a more meaningful way, and start shifting away from wood consumption, year by year, decade by decade. It's not going to happen overnight, but we need to start shifting away from wood consumption to less consumption, tree-free alternatives, recycled alternatives, smaller structures, so we can keep more carbon in our forests and protect a lot more forest habitat. And because I'm an optimist and I believe we're going to do that, I believe that we are going to start drawing down atmospheric carbon, and we're going to start seeing a positive trend as opposed to a consistently worsening trend every year and every decade. If we don't do anything to curb the climate crisis, if we just consume more and more fossil fuels and keep logging more and more of our forests, then we're going to have catastrophic consequences. And forests will be impacted mostly by rising temperatures, and so will lots of other ecosystems and human communities all across the world. But I will tell you this, that right now, even during the extreme droughts that we've seen recently, we're seeing tremendous natural conifer regeneration in these large high-intensity fire patches, which again are only a portion of these big fires. But we're seeing amazing natural forest regrowth in these areas, even at the lower elevation forests where our biggest concerns are. And so basically what it means to me is this. The big threat to forests is rising temperatures from climate change. It's not wildfires. We need to decouple that conversation, because they're not the same thing. If anything, I'm seeing that wildfires are actually giving our forests more resilience in the face of climate change.
Thank you for that. Pretty good news. I know that was heavy stuff to cover, but thank you. Thomas asks, you present a conundrum, old growth unburned areas versus wildfire burns at high intensity. How do you prevent climate change, wind-driven fire from gobbling up both old growth and thinned forests alike?
Yeah. This is a great question. You know, it's all about scale. You know, this is in ecology, really everything comes down to scale, spatial scale, temporal scale. You know, I talked a lot in my presentation about the ecological value and importance of post-fire habitat, including those snag forest patches created by high intensity fire. That's absolutely true. Same thing is true, by the way, of snag forest created by drought cycles and native bark beetles. You know, if it's unburned, same thing. And patches of dead trees are incredibly important. That doesn't mean that doesn't mean you want too much of a good thing. You don't want too much or too little. And so this is something I stress all the time, is that in our forests, we want these cycles of natural disturbance to operate within the natural range of variability. We don't want too little, we don't want too much. What a lot of people don't realize, though, is that we still have too little right now. And so when we have a little bit more, we shouldn't lament that. We should actually celebrate it. Let me put this in perspective. Historically, before fire suppression and logging, between 20 to 30% of our forests in any given area were in a snag forest habitat state. In other words, naturally regenerating after high intensity fire or some other high intensity natural disturbance. And whereas the rest were mid-successional forests and late successional and old growth forests, different stages and ages. But 20 to 30% conservatively, in some places, closer to 40%, we're in that kind of snag forest state. We also call it complex early seral forest. Put this in perspective, right now, even after the recent big drought that happened between 2012 and 2017, mostly after the recent large fires, only about 12 to 14% of our forests are snag forest habitat. Are in that state, and that's probably on the high end. That estimate, it could be a little bit closer to 11 or 12%. Bottom line is that it was like 6 or 8% before that. Now it's closer to around 12, and that's not something we should lament. It's not something we should feel terrible about. It's actually something we should celebrate. It would be great if we can get actually over 20%, but we don't want it to be 50 or 60%. That would be too high. That would be unnatural.
Okay, Ruth asks, what do you think of the many that say that past fire suppression is increasing severity of current fires? Would it be advisable to not suppress some of the fires that occur in weather conditions when it is easy to put out fires?
Yes, I'll answer this two-part question. I'll answer the second part first. Yes, it is definitely a good idea to allow more of the ignitions to burn in our forests without suppressing them, especially in more remote forests and especially with lightning strikes. We need to do that. We call it just different terms for it. Some people call it prescribed natural fire. Some people call it managed wildfire. There's a broad consensus in the scientific community that we need more of that. And so that is really key. And it's interesting because there is an effect of previous fire on subsequent fire for a certain period of time. Typically about 10 years, previous fire will moderate the intensity of a subsequent fire. But the assumption was, and then mostly that's just because fire consumes the pine needles and the dry leaves and the dry grasses and sort of shrubs in the understory and some little seedlings in the understory. And that's really what is most combustible. And it takes a little while for that to kind of reaccumulate in the ecosystem. Sometimes as little as 2 or 3 years, sometimes more like 9 or 10 years, depending on the forest. But point is that the assumption was made a long time ago that every decade that passes without fire, you'll have more and more potential for high intensity fire with every passing decade. And that's what has been debunked and discredited, that notion. We know now that's not true. The overwhelming majority of research finds that after that first decade or so, it's really kind of flat. There's really no increase in fire potential with each passing decade. And in fact, a lot of the research is indicating that once you get past 70 or 80 years since the last fire, the potential for high intensity fire starts to go down, not up, for a lot of the reasons I talked about earlier, those microclimate effects that a denser forest has with a high canopy cover.
Marion asks, where can we get more information on fire hardening our homes?
Yeah, well, certainly we have some information on, excuse me, on John Muir Project's website about this. California Chaparral Institute has wonderful information on its website about home hardening. And I've got a lot more information about this, a whole chapter devoted to this subject in my book, Smokescreen, Debunking Wildfire Myths to Save Our Forests and Our Climate.
You mentioned hog fuel, that is a process that the lumber industry uses to burn the byproducts, I guess maybe to help power their factories. Would eliminating that process of hog fuel and for the forest, the lumber industry to like maybe compost the excess byproducts from the lumber industry, would that help?
No, it would. It's a good question, but no, it wouldn't, because it would just slightly slow the carbon going into the atmosphere. So instead of being incinerated for energy production at the lumber mill to power the lumber mill and cut the, and mill the logs, instead, if it was compost or some other kind of short-lived product, the carbon would take a little bit longer to go into the atmosphere, but not much. The bottom line is that that's really not the way forward. The way forward is to keep the carbon in our forests, just as we're trying to keep it in the ground.
Okay, Michelle asks, how much logging is for paper and what is the best substitute for it?
Yeah, great question. It really depends on the region. So in boreal forests, in certain areas, a lot of the logging is for paper. In more temperate conifer forests, less so. Mostly it's for lumber and for biomass. So it really depends on the region. In the southeastern US, there are certain areas where a lot of it's for paper, some of the upper Midwestern forests as well. So again, it's very regional. But as far as alternatives, you can make paper out of lots of different non-tree plants. You can make it out of hemp. You can make it out of kenaf. Certainly, we can recycle a lot more paper. A lot of paper, enormous amounts of paper is going into landfills every single year, and that's avoidable. So we can do a whole lot better with that and keep a lot of carbon out of the atmosphere and a lot more trees in our forests, simply by shifting away from paper from trees. And so I think there's a lot of different ways that we can do this, but we need to start that conversation and be intentional about it. It doesn't have to happen overnight, but we need to start it and make progress toward that, including toilet paper, including paper for writing or printing. Anything can be done without trees. We don't need trees for this. Same thing with building materials, by the way. There are now companies making load-bearing structural blocks out of hempcrete. Which is actually carbon negative. So it's not like there's no environmental impacts. There's some water involved, of course, but from a carbon emission standpoint, from a forest protection standpoint, it's vastly preferable, and it's load bearing now for residential and commercial construction. So there are lots of alternatives, and those are just some. There are many more.
Thank you. Colonel Curtis asks, what's your recommendation to move away from wood products? Is there a proposed alternative fossil fuel produced synthetic material? I think you kind of just answered that, but any other ways that
I did. But the one thing I want, that's basically the question I just answered. But there is one thing I want to mention there that to me just kind of needs to be kind of top line is, it's not just about alternatives, it's also about just reducing our consumption in every way we can. Just let me give you one example. Just not that long ago, just some decades ago, it was very normal for an average, home in the US for a family of 4 to be 1,000 square feet or 1,200 square feet, even less than 1,000 square feet. That was very normal. Whole communities were built with homes of that size. My wife grew up in a house that was 1,000 square feet, 3-bedroom, 2-bath house, family of 4. Doesn't feel small at all because it's laid out so intelligently. And then over the years, 1,600 square feet became the norm, and then 2,000, and then 2,500, and then 3,000, and then everyone wanted a 4,000 square foot home for a family of the same size. And I guess the point is this, is that, sure, I understand the desirability of space, but we have consequences that we can't ignore with the climate and extinction crises, and we're going to have to start making some changes. We're going to have to start, making some sacrifices. And one of those things is our consumption patterns. So I think we need to use non-wood alternatives for building and paper whenever possible, but we also just need to use less whenever possible.
I hope I didn't ask this. It's getting late and I'm a little tired. George asked, what do you think of Sfsc certified lumber?
Yeah, it's a great question. FSC stands for Forest Stewardship Council. It's a certification system that basically says, well, this lumber is produced more, with lower environmental impacts, more sustainably. I have to say, I feel like the conversation has kind of moved beyond Forest Stewardship Council. There's no question, there's research on this that certified forests, there's more carbon in those forests typically than there are in forests that do not have FSC certification. At the same time, I think the problem, the concern for me is that when people see that FSC label, they think, okay, I can do this without being concerned about habitat impacts. I can consume the same amount of wood that I was consuming before without being concerned about the climate. And that's not true at all. And so if more people are consuming wood products because they see the FSC label and we basically don't reduce our wood consumption, we're going to have the same impacts on the climate and the same impacts on biodiversity that we were before. And so I think that for me, the path forward is really about protection. It's about pro-forestation. It's about protecting vast areas of forest from logging so that they can not only conserve biodiversity, but also draw down a lot more atmospheric carbon, acquiring a lot more private forest lands into protected public ownership, federal, state, county, all the above. And for whatever land stays in private ownership and where logging continues to occur, providing incentives, financial incentives to landowners to log a lot less and to keep a lot more carbon in their forests. To me, that's the path forward, not certification so much anymore.
Jesse asks, you seem to be focused on Western fires and forest species. What would you say about climate-driven massification of Midwestern forests where native hardwoods are being replaced by shade-tolerant species that aren't part of the historical fire-adapted forest type? Thinning and prescribed fire are part of a comprehensive solution, according to recent research.
Well, I would disagree. There certainly are studies out there that promote logging and prescribed fire. And by the way, when prescribed fire is associated with logging, it's typically burning of logging slash. It's not really reintroduction of fire. There's a number of studies out there that promote that in forests of the eastern U.S. and the Ozarks and the southern Appalachians and the northern Appalachians, in the upper Midwestern forests. I have a whole chapter in my book, Smokescreen, devoted to this. But what you find when you peel away the layers of the onion, those studies are by and large funded by the U.S. Forest Service and by the logging industry. And what you find is that there's a huge body of research by independent scientists who are not funded by the logging industry. They're telling a very, very different story and are producing data to back it up. And what they're showing is that the best way to restore those forests is to allow them to accumulate more carbon by not logging them, and to allow natural lightning strikes to burn in those forests to restore natural species composition and heterogeneity. You do not mimic that by logging. And in fact, logging actually sets those forests back in most ways and oftentimes makes the fires burn hotter and faster anyway when they occur. And there are fires that occur in the eastern forests. And I talk about that in my book too.
Thank you. Next question is from Andrew of the Audubon Society. He says, go rewilding. Woo-hoo!
Well, thank you. Appreciate that. Agree.
He says, can you speak more about the difference, if any, between the forest-focused research that you've done and fires in chaparral habitats?
Yeah, so I mentioned this earlier, but it bears repeating. We still have, fires, we've had, fire frequency has been increasing over the last 20 years in forests. And a part of that is because of climate change. but we still have less than we had historically, less than we had naturally. So we do not have an excess of fire in our forests. We actually still have less. We need more. Chaparral is different. We actually have too much fire in Chaparral, in Southern California and elsewhere in California, but especially in Southern California. And that is overwhelmingly because of unplanned human ignitions, because you've got these large population centers right next to the Chaparral. Very different from a lot of the higher elevation mountain forests that are very far from population centers. In the higher elevation mountain forests, most of the ignitions are lightning strikes. Low elevation forests, it's mostly human ignitions. But in Chaparral, I forget the exact figure, but it's over 95% certainly of the ignitions are human ignitions and accidental. So really the solution there from my standpoint is we need to get a handle on those unplanned human ignitions. We need more personnel. We need to hire more people, state, county, federal, to prevent those unplanned human ignitions during fire season. And if there's a place for fire suppression, that's it. If you have an ecosystem that has too much fire, I'm all for suppressing a fire in that ecosystem, especially if it's near a town as well. But we shouldn't be doing that out in the mountain forest. It's a very, very different situation.
Dr. Hanson, you're a mind reader. You just answered the next question from Greg, so thank you for that. He was asking about Chaparral and whether we should be putting those out, so thank you. Ariane asks, how can we convince local and state officials to stop thinning our urban forests? For example, the UC University system is promoting logging in pursuit of development, buildings for classrooms, research, and dormitories.
Yeah, well, we need to become more active and more vocal, and all of us. We need to become more active, more vocal with regard to policymakers, state legislators, and also members of Congress, and not just in terms of direct communications, letters, text messages, phone calls, emails to legislators, but also in terms of simple things that don't cost any money, but make a big impact, like letters to the editor of local newspapers, opinion editorials on local newspapers. We just really need to raise a profile of this. Certainly there are a lot of us who are in this field and full time that do this, but we need a lot of help and to shift things, because the questioner is the question is absolutely right. The University of California is promoting the wrong thing, and so a lot of other universities. One thing that I mentioned in my book is that a lot of university scientists are actually funded by the Forest Service, and they don't divulge this or disclose it when they're talking to the press or they're talking to interest groups or community groups or environmentalists or policymakers. And that's something that really needs to be talked about. And oftentimes, you're talking to a university scientist, you're actually talking to someone who's funded by the logging industry, and what they say and what they promote is reflected in that. So I think there's a lot we can do, but we're going to have to hold accountable politicians, regardless of their political affiliation, and that includes some of the Democrats who know very well how to talk a good game in political speeches about climate change mitigation and climate solutions, but in terms of how they vote, they're doing the wrong thing in many cases.
Janice asked, what legislation or funding mechanism should we reference when asking for more funds for home hardening?
Well, unfortunately, there is not a bill right now that would do that. There was a bill that would focus on home hardening and defensible space. It was called the Wildfire Defense Act. We played a role in getting that bill introduced. It was introduced by then Senator Kamala Harris, who is now Vice President Harris. But after she became vice president, no one in the Senate has picked up the ball and run with it. And so that bill has not been reintroduced. It should be reintroduced. Again, it's called the Wildfire Defense Act, and it's all about protecting homes and communities from wildfire and providing the funding and resources to do that, doing it in the right way. So that's one, that's a bill that needs to be reintroduced. But also we need someone in the House of Representatives to step up and introduce legislation to protect our national forests from logging and get the U.S. Forest Service out of the logging business. There's a bill that we've written called the Forest and Climate Act that would do that. It would redirect logging subsidies into a jobs program to create fire-safe communities through home hardening and defensible space. So really, we just need more people active and telling legislators, listen, we really need a change in direction.
Dr. Hanson, how you doing? I'm really firing a lot of questions at you. You doing
Oh,
okay?
I'm fine. I'm fine.
Okay, great.
Listen, I love the questions and I love talking about this stuff. As you probably figured out, I find it endlessly fascinating. So these are great, very intelligent questions, and I appreciate it. I'm perfectly happy to answer more.
Great. I'm actually going to ask another question from Janice. I'm having a hard time doing the whole sorting and shuffling thing. Janice also asked, how aware is the insurance industry of your findings? And do you see them to be willing participants in seeking solutions that you described? Or do they prefer to simply jack up our rates or abandon us on the urban wildfire edge?
Well, that's a really, really sharp question. Jacking up the rates, yeah, I mean, insurance companies tend to do that. And so I can't speak to that or say that they're doing the right thing there. But what I can say is that the insurance industry is actually kind of ahead of the curve on this. They started paying attention to the science years before most politicians did on this, because they understand that, listen, there are things that can be done that really can, in a very cost-effective way, prevent homes from burning in a wildfire. And so they've been starting to focus on that and putting money into it. So the insurance industry is actually, ironically, at least with respect to home hardening and defensible space, relatively progressive and well-informed. But when it comes to jacking up rates, well, yeah, they still do that, unfortunately.
Okay, next question is from Janice. How aware is, I'm sorry, don't want to repeat that one, from Alina. Have you done any studies in the Northern California coastal forests?
That's a great question. Yeah, I'm mostly a field ecologist, so I'm a boots on the ground ecologist. I go out and I gather field data. I spend thousands of hours out in the forest and have for decades now. But I also do studies using remote sensing data, satellite imagery, because that's a really useful tool. I just don't rely on it too heavily, but I incorporate it into a lot of my research. And so I have not done field studies in the forests, coastal forests of Northwestern California, but I have done a number of studies that are broad landscape scale regional studies using satellite imagery, remote sensing data, to look at fire patterns and trends and things like that. So I've published a number of those, and some of those are on the John Muir Project's website that are open access.
Okay, Jean asks, is there any type of logging that you do support?
The best way for me to answer that is to say it this way. The best we can do for our forests is to do less logging wherever possible and no logging in as many places as possible. It's not about logging differently. I mean, some people think, well, if we thin the forest, that's better than clear cuts. Well, okay, on a per acre basis, that's true. The impact isn't as extreme, but there's still a significant impact. And if the logging levels are roughly the same, then you're having a somewhat less impact on far more acreage. And so you're not really gaining anything. And so I get the questions like this a lot, and I really am not interested in promoting the conversation about better forestry and better logging. That's really not where I think the path forward is. I think the path forward is in large protected landscapes and allow nature to passively rewild and restore areas that have been degraded by past logging, protect the intact forests that haven't been logged and roaded in the past, like roadless areas, protect them as wilderness, and then acquire vast acquisition from willing sellers of private forest lands into protected ownership. But some areas are still going to remain in private forest lands, and they're still going to be logging. And I think it's really just a matter of trying to figure out how we incentivize greater forest protection and less logging and more forest carbon storage. So I guess I'm promoting a bigger, bolder shift societally, both in this country and countries around the world. And in part, I say this because, as I mentioned before, the United States is the biggest global culprit in terms of annual carbon emissions from logging. I'm a lead author on a letter to Congress from over 200 scientists that was sent to Congress in November of last year, where we noted that carbon emissions from logging in the US annually is now on par with carbon emissions from burning coal in the US. That's how bad it is. And so I think that we need to take bold steps. And that doesn't mean that no one's going to ever use any wood product anywhere in the future, but it means we need to begin a shift away and set an example for the rest of the world. I think that, the problem is that, we know we need to protect the forests of Brazil and in Congo that are being devastated by logging and by deforestation for livestock grazing. We know we need to do that, but how do we credibly encourage those countries to take bold steps to protect their forests when we're the biggest global culprit in terms of logging and carbon emissions, on the planet? I think that we need to lead by example.
Anita asks, we hear again and again that due to a history of fire suppression, forests are too dense and require thinning. The belief seems to be that too many trees compete for resources, water, which contributes to drought die-off. What do you think about current forest live tree densities? Great
question. So, and I talk about this a lot in my book, Smokescreen. I've got, many studies in the endnotes cited to support the points I make. But bottom line is this: in every forested region of the US, we have less carbon in our forests than we had historically before logging policies, before colonization and logging began. And the reason we have less carbon is because of decades, and in some cases centuries, of logging and removal of carbon from our forests. It is an absolute myth, a logging industry myth, that we have too much biomass in our forests and that somehow we need to remove more trees from our forests. There's numerous studies that have looked at this, and what they find is that we actually, in every forested region of the US, we have our forests are far below their natural carbon storage potential. And in a way, that's good news too. It's of course, reflective of past damage and carbon removals and impacts from logging. But what it means is right now, if we change course, if we protect more forests, if we start to shift away from logging and shift away from wood consumption, that means that because our forests are so far below their carbon storage potential, that if we protect our forests, that difference is massive climate change mitigation potential. And so I think that we really need to understand that pro-forestation and forest protection is a co-equal part of climate solutions, along with moving away from fossil fuels. But bottom line is that in terms of trees, trees, as I mentioned earlier, the studies from the Forest Service that claim that there were very few trees per acre, those have all been discredited by stacks of subsequent studies that I cite in my book that found that those same historical records show that there were far more trees, and most of those tree records were left out by the Forest Service scientists. So we actually had a lot more carbon in our forests historically, in most cases, than we do now. Last thing we should be doing is removing more trees from our forests. Not to mention the fact that, as I mentioned, denser forests with more trees don't tend to burn more intensely. Fire is driven mostly by weather and climate. It's not about forest density mostly, but to the extent that forest density is a factor, it's very secondary, and it doesn't work in the way people think. It works in the opposite. Denser forests burn less intensely, generally.
Okay, there's a lot of talk about 30 by 30 and eventually 50 by 50. What do you think about E.O. Wilson's half-Earth idea?
It's a wonderful idea, and I support it fully. I support 30 by 30, protecting 30% of wildlands by 2030, and I support 50 by 50, protecting 50% by 2050. And this goes back to what I was saying earlier about the U.S. needing to set a global example, and we really do here. Right now, unfortunately, we have an administration that supports in its outward-facing communication supports 30 by 30. But the Biden administration right now is promoting this massive logging program. The Agriculture Secretary, Tom Vilsack, who oversees the U.S. Forest Service, just recently proposed a $50 billion logging plan over the next 10 years to log 50 million acres on both public and private lands, mostly public lands. And this would just shoot ourselves in the foot from a climate change perspective. So, the Biden administration needs to hear from the public that this is not the way to go, and that people who voted for Joe Biden, who said I'm all about science and all about climate change mitigation, didn't vote for him, to set us back on climate solutions.
Okay, question from Jesse. The Forest Service is applying a lot of money for forest health work that is in line with what you are proposing. when you follow that money, you'll end up at so much more progressive management than logging. Is it fair to paint the Forestry Service as nothing more than a timber beast? Sorry, I think I may have botched that question, but.
No, I get it. It's a good question. And I think it's a fair question. The fact is that the Forest Service is not monolithic. There are lots of people in the agency who have differing views. A lot of the people in the Forest Service are very, very much in line with the current science, about pro-forestation, about protecting forests for biodiversity and climate solutions, and for the recreation economy. A lot of people in the Forest Service. Unfortunately, they don't tend to rise through the ranks as much as the people who want to, bend or break environmental laws and promote commercial logging. And that's the problem, is that under the existing laws, the U.S. Forest Service gets to keep the revenue. They sell timber from public lands. First of all, that's allowed under the current laws, unlike national parks, where that's not part of the management regime. A national forest, they're allowed to sell timber and they're allowed to keep the revenue, just like a logging corporation. And so that puts good people in a bad position. It puts good people in a position where they behave badly, because the way the system is set up, it financially incentivizes bad behavior that damages forests and harms the climate and biodiversity. And so what I believe, and what many of my colleagues believe, and we basically say this in the letter from November of last year, over 200 of us, scientists from all across the country, climate scientists and research ecologists, is that we really need to protect our public forests and acquire more forests, so that we can mitigate the climate crisis, and that we would draw down much more atmospheric carbon if we would do that. But you're absolutely right. I mean, the Forest Service does a lot of things, some good things for wildlife and things for recreation. It's not all about logging. It's just that under the existing laws, because of the way they're incentivized, logging is mostly what they focus on. And that's a problem.
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Hanson, I just got to say that I have fired so many questions at you, and you have answered them all with aplomb. I'm really impressed by both your lecture. It was really filled with a ton of stuff. And from all the really in-depth and smart questions that we had from our record audience, this has been a fantastic presentation. I want to hand things off to Marian, who has some final words for us.
Sure, thank you.
Oh, I do. I want to agree with you, Carl. This has been a fantastic audience and a fantastic talk. So thank you, everybody. I do want to give a shout out, though, to my friend Greg Rubin, who is on this call. And I would like Greg to put his contact information, if he would be willing to do so, into the chat, because he does a lot of work with native California plants. And he also does a presentation that shows that you could plant native California plants and your property will not burn. It'd probably be better off than your neighbor who's got ice plant all over everything. So please include that. And also, speaking of chat, everybody, please save the chat. You could do that by going and hovering over those three little dots, and it'll drop down and it'll give you that option to save. So many good references and questions in this. I think you're going to want to refer back to it. And then Dr. Hanson, a lot of requests came in for you to speak to different groups. And also, I know that a lot of people would like to connect with you. So would you please be willing to put your contact information in the chat so we can get a hold of you? So that's the best way to contact you.
I sure will. I'm typing in right now. Just a second.
Okay.
I just typed my email address into the chat. So folks want to reach out if you want, we have fact sheets and things that might be useful, in terms of, communicating with your elected officials or writing letters to the editor. I'd be happy to send those fact sheets along with citations and scientific studies. And also, if you would like me to talk to your group, I'd be happy to talk to you about that as well.
Okay, that's wonderful. So we have a tradition here of like to thank our guest speakers. We purchase an item for them to show our appreciation. And in this case, it'll be interesting to see what you think. We have purchased you a tree in your honor that is going to be planted someplace in California that has been burned by wildfires. So now you've got me kind of curious. I'm kind of wanting to get a hold of this group and ask them exactly how are they doing it? Are they irrigating or making sure that they're doing it properly? But anyway, thank you again. And thank you very much to our great audience.
Thank you very much, and great questions, and thanks for the invitation. It was wonderful speaking to you all tonight.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.
Night.
Take care. Thank you.